Congressman Russ Fulcher, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. It's good to be back in business, let's put it that way, just fresh off a government shutdown.
You guys were supposed to be ready at like a moment's notice if things
Yeah.
came back on. So it's kind of like, it would be like having a spring break where you don't know if spring break is over, like at any point. So you can't really get comfortable and you can't, engage in any plans.
Well, ironically, I was here almost for the entire shutdown. There were a number of reasons behind that, but I was here and each actually helped the speaker with some some pro forma sessions. We still had to go into session legally for procedural purposes, and so let's just say glad we're back in business because we got a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah. Listen, I'm very thankful that you had the time to meet. There are a lot of concerns in Idaho, a myriad of issues, but some of the most fundamental are coming from the water users and coming from the energy sector, right? Obviously, we have an enormous amount of concern about data centers and the cost of electricity skyrocketing as the demand skyrockets. It's projected to go up something like 50% just for Idaho Power's demand, and they have an obligation to serve, obviously. There's a big concern with that. That also ties into water. We obviously had the water call in 2024. People are very concerned about, look, managing water so we don't end up like some of our surrounding states, which are notable failures as far as water management and infrastructure. Talk to me about water. You have a bill that's been going forward on helping with aquifer recharge, but the broader system of water management and storage in Idaho, what do you think Idaho can do, and how can the federal government, if at all, assist in that?
Well, it's important to understand a couple things. Of all the issues we deal with, and we deal with a lot, the two most complex to me is the healthcare system and water rights. And they are both immensely complex, and uniquely so in Idaho for water, because in Idaho, you've got multiple interests that are competing all the time. You've got the federal interests, you've got the state interests, you've got tribal interests, you've got local, county, municipality interests, and they all compete. And the unique volume of federal land, of course, makes the federal government a major player in all that. So what we're trying to do is put through a legislative process, that will simply break down some of those barriers, especially with the aquifer recharge having to cross over federal lands and just deal with the federal infrastructure. We do get federal infrastructure dollars for some of that. We have to, because there's so much federal land in Idaho. You don't have the property tax and those types of vehicles to fund it. And so the federal government's a big player, but it really complicates things. So traditionally in Idaho, it's the first in time, first in right. Who's got the first claim to that water right is the first one to get it, but not always. And that's where the fights come in. But that is our lifeblood. Much of our state would be barren without irrigation to various pieces of that, including the Treasure Valley, by the way. So the importance of it is huge. The federal government is a player. What we're attempting to do is to make the federal government less of a player, because I believe, and I think most Idahoans believe, that we should have the rights to that. That ties directly to the subject matter you talked about with power and energy because of hydro. Hydro is a huge component. Not just hydro, but also the Lewiston Port with transport, of course, of goods to the ocean. But the projection of needs for power and energy is going like a hockey stick up and to the right. I recently did a tour of Micron Technology, which is where I kind of grew up in my adult life. I worked there for almost the first 15 years of that company. It's absolutely exploded. They were explaining to myself and my team that they have five expansions planned, but only enough energy, only enough power to do the first one. Well, that's just one company. And so you extrapolate that across the state's needs, and we just don't have the level of incoming power sources to fuel that. Water is a big part of it. Water is also, of course, a driver of our ag sector. Ag is still the biggest single economic driver in our state. Without the water, you don't have it. So it is intermingled. But those are two of the complex yet very, very important things that we try to deal with in government.
And when you're talking about transportation of water for recharge across federal lands, obviously moving things across federal lands and existing ditches or canals, those were originally established. So it's okay, it's going across federal lands, but you guys have been doing it for a long time. So you, the canal company, you're allowed to keep transporting water across this canal, but only you and only for the purpose of transporting it to whatever end you might have. And the problem obviously then we run into is, okay, well, what if we want to use that canal to actually recharge the aquifer and not go to this end route? That's where you got a bunch of red tape with the federal government saying, hey, wait, you're using this canal for a purpose other than what was originally granted to you. Right. And you're attempting with your bill to say, okay, now hang on a second. It shouldn't be that complex if the owner of the canal and the owner of the water are all kind of together with, okay, this is the stated goal. There shouldn't be all the red tape, but of course, that's not always the case. So what you're working to do is simplify that so that we could more effectively recharge and have more opportunities to do so.
Yes, and the most concise way to summarize that, and you did well, but is to put more of the control in the local stakeholders' hands, right? Because it's gotten to the point where pretty much every time we do anything, we have to get some kind of federal approval to do that. We're trying to push more of that control locally. This is one means to do that. Find ourselves doing that in a lot of different ways. And again, I can't overstate the impact of having a tremendous amount of federal lands in the state is. Right. In this town, Washington, D.C., most of my colleagues don't deal with a lot of the things that we deal with or our state legislature deals with for that reason. We are, in many ways, tenants in our own state because the federal government controls almost 2/3 of the landmass. So this is just one of those other things that a lot of my colleagues don't really have to worry about much, but it's a big deal in the West. It's a big deal in Idaho.
I heard somebody say recently at a presentation in Boise that the proper role of government is really only to engage in that which the people themselves individually cannot engage in. When we start talking about water and we're talking about transporting water, okay, different, smaller projects, okay, but when you look at larger water storage and water management, that doesn't just benefit Idaho. We're talking about a benefit to the West as a whole because the water that originates either in Wyoming or Idaho obviously goes through multiple states and benefits with umpteen uses along the way. When we start looking at some of the larger projects, like rebuilding certain reservoirs or increasing the capacity of reservoirs, that's something where you get to numbers and problems and benefit, by the way, that are so large and potentially so beneficial but also costly that it's kind of like, okay, this would have to necessarily be in Idaho because that's where the water storage would benefit. Like, you're not going to benefit the most from making a giant reservoir 10 miles from the ocean. It's like, no. We want to get it right at the source, and then it gets reused as many times as possible on its way out to the ocean. Do you think that there's a path forward for Idaho to get assistance with that and start engaging the federal government in larger water infrastructure projects?
I do, but it's an ongoing battle. Our predecessors in the state, and I'd say the Pacific Northwest in general, have been, I would say, relatively wise with their planning. We have the reservoirs, we have the various system with dams for hydro and that type of thing. We can control it pretty well. There's the irrigation component, there's a flood control component, there's recreation that come with that. Of course, hydro. These are all critical needs, especially for the West and Pacific Northwest. But once again, because of the fact that it's multi-state infrastructure that impacts, basically the West or the Pacific Northwest in this case, then you have to have the federal government involved, and also because of all the federal resources, federal lands, it's just an integral partner that you can't go without. Absolutely. The issue is who are the decision makers at each of those stages along the way. And part of my effort is to drive a lot of those decision-making processes more local. But on the other hand, we've got to have federal involvement mainly for that infrastructure. There's just no other way you could put that in place. But without it, you don't have your economy. There's been discussion about removing the dams in the lower Snake River, for example. If you take those out, then you've got the economy of the Pacific Northwest. That's just one example. And I remember my grandfather I don't know all the detail because he was pretty much gone by the time I was just a little kid, but he had involvement with the New York Canal system when that was being put in place, and Lucky Peak outside of Boise, which fuels so much of that Treasure Valley, and the big artery is the New York Canal. And I remember him just as a little kid. He was articulating the water board and how that's really separate from the local government. It's separate from the federal government. It's because at that time they knew that water was the lifeblood of the economy. And so to this day, the water board operates largely autonomous from local and state and federal government. They have their own rights locally and whatnot. And that's part of that reason why, and it's part of the history.
When you talk about the lower Snake River dams, there are so many issues that go into it, both on the conservation standpoint and from a utility standpoint. And again, coming back to power, there is the articulation that, hey, look, these dams are run of river, so they produce electricity when they have the greatest flow of water, which is generally in the springtime, right? April, May, June. And our consumption is during like July and August. When things are hottest, we're running our air conditioners. But there's a problem in siloing off that individual exchange, because if you consider the Western grid as a whole, at least it's been explained to me, that there's a problem with, okay, if each individual state started knocking down things that might be running at a loss at individual times, then all of a sudden the power infrastructure that exists right now on the Western grid gets decimated, because then we're only using the things that make us money the absolute most amount of the time, and everybody's buying and selling at a loss across the grid. This leads to this interconnectivity on the Western grid that a lot of people have gotten very, very worried about. Because like, look, we're so dependent on each other. We're so interconnected. If we, for instance, if you start Idaho Power, 40% of their electric generation comes from gas pipelines, right? So the actual concern that some people have with Idaho Power should actually go to Intermountain Gas or whoever owns the pipelines, and for instance, the odorizing stations that are above ground, or the pressurizing stations, things like that. So from a security standpoint, a lot of people have started pushing to, look, we need to break up the grid. We need to start using smaller, small modular reactors or things of that nature. And there has been an indication from this administration that they're very positive on that. But a lot needs to happen for that to actually come online in Idaho, specifically financial backstops. When you're dealing with regulated monopolies, they can't take shots in the dark. They don't know how much these things cost. Do you think there's any desire within the administration, not just to encourage the resurgence and kind of renaissance of the nuclear industry, but also help them figure out a way? It's like, okay, we'll give you a backstop for a couple of these, so that the industry can establish a specific target point for cost, perhaps cost savings, and then you can start rolling these out in mass.
Yeah, there's two major factors here, and you touched on both of them. One is the functionality of it, because it is immensely interconnected. As an example of that, I just learned recently that the power generated at Lucky Peak, which is basically right, not in Boise, but right next
outside.
To, right. That goes to Seattle. I had no idea, and that's just because when that got contracted, that's who won the bid, and that's where that power goes. So I always thought, well, it's right there. That must be powering West Boise or East Boise. No, that's Seattle. So that's the functionality, and is all interconnected. And there's some good and there's some bad in that. But that brings up the second point, and that's security. Functionality and security. Now, in this day and age, not only do we have the fragility of the grid in as a potential weakness, but we have cyber attacks that can threaten segments of the grid or even large portions of it. So, to your point, you brought up one of the benefits of a small modular nuclear reactor or that type of power. One of the benefits of that is that you can avoid a lot of that interconnectivity, and you can isolate to a certain region to be powered just by that. And so if something really drastic happens in Los Angeles, it doesn't necessarily impact Idaho, or vice versa for that matter, because that's the way that it's worked out now. Or if we take a major cyber attack, that's part of this hardening of the grid. If you've heard that term, the hardening of the grid, that's part of the Homeland Security effort to be able to isolate and take critical regions and make it less vulnerable to being fully interconnected. But there's other things that come to play here. The U.S. is a pioneer at this, right? And so that's really good. We were the first really to electrify on a big, massive scale, but that also means that a lot of our components are the oldest and the most fragile. And so not necessarily the most modern techniques. Modern technology is interconnecting that grid. So that's another one of our challenges, and that's where, once again, the federal efforts go into being responsible for security and the safety and security. But there's, again, you point this out, but there's really no way to just take Idaho and isolate that effort. If you take a look where the rivers flow and how the basins and the topography works, it makes no sense to try to take a state effort. And so you have to coordinate by regions. You have to coordinate by the topography when you lay your transmission lines, when you put your dams in place and other infrastructure. So, but I go back to, that's why I say, our predecessors, I think, had quite a bit of wisdom when they put the basic system in place, because it served us pretty well. But like everything else, there's growth, there's shifts in population, there's shifts in need, and so we have to be able to progressively transform with the times for the needs that not only we have, but what are coming right around the corner. And it takes a lot of coordination, and there is a rightful role of government, I believe, with the federal government to be involved with that.
With small modular reactors, is there any discussion of like, hey, essentially the problem that's been explained to me from larger power producers is like, look, if we pay on average $70 per megawatt, we could tolerate a system that goes up to maybe 120, 130, whatever the number might be. Like, we could only tolerate up to like this amount before it became this horrible loser. But we don't know how much we don't know how much it's actually going to be. It could be $200 a megawatt or $300 a megawatt in the end, in the final assessment. And again, they don't know. Is there any discussion of participation with the federal government of, okay, can we just get one of them built? Could somebody take the leap to build one of these, give the individual investor a backstop, say, look, you're gonna swallow more than you want. You want 120 max, you're gonna have to take 140. But we'll stop everything at 140. You'll take a loss, fine, but we'll all work together. And then once we have that target point, great, we move forward. Because it appears like Utah and Wyoming are both very bullish on nuclear, and they're participating very aggressively with trying to help with backstops. And whether Idaho does or doesn't, we're not going to get this resurgence of nuclear without assistance to help these industries actually get off the ground.
It's a very interesting history with nuclear, but if you just put the Wayback Time Machine in place, we've really been discouraging that industry since the 1980s. The 3 Mile Island incident really stunted the nuclear industry for power generation in the U.S. And now what's happened since then is, in that process, we've kind of thwarted the supply chain too, right? And so Idaho is a leader in the development and the testing of small modular nuclear and nuclear in general with the Idaho National Lab. And so, and I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which deals with this. And so we get exposed to that a lot. And that's the challenges are twofold. One is we've hindered our own supply chain.
Right.
And so that infrastructure for all the stuff you need to support the industry is not there anymore. And that's having to be redeveloped or contracted with places that do have it. Unfortunately, some of our European friends, some of our Asian friends, they have that. We don't. And so we're having to fill that supply chain, get that going again. And the other one is the approvals process. And that's where so many federal agencies come into play. The technology has changed. The technology is better. From my vantage point, it's safer. There's many more protections for safety and security for nuclear technology. And if you look at it from an environmental perspective, there's a very low carbon footprint with that. And so it's an attractive source. It's once it gets established again, then that could be a real big part of the solution that we need to grow more power infrastructure. But it's a permitting, it's the supply chain. And, there are two ways to think about it. One is, okay, how does the government subsidize this? And that's one option, and there's going to be some of that. But I'm much more in favor of how do you just incentivize the private sector to do it. And you know what? All they need, all they want is predictability.
Right.
If you give a developer for a nuclear project the confidence and that, look, you contract this deal out, you're going to get a return over this window of time. That's, I think, the best thing we can do. And that's the best thing we can do with taxpayer funds is not take it to subsidize something, but just say, look, we're going to approve this project, or when we do approve this project, you've got 20 years or whatever the window of time you need to know that you're going to get, we're not going to stop you. There's going to be, there's got to be some rudimentary safety benchmarks and all that, but we're not going to thwart your efforts, and you're going to get a return on your investment. If we just turn the industry loose, they'll take care of it. And that's where my personal preference is. I would rather steer give the industry the encouragement and the predictability to be able to go out and develop this on their own.
With what you're talking about with the supply chain leading up to the actual creation of these things, one of them is obviously fuel and refinement, which you were obviously touching on.
HALEU, yeah.
And obviously Idaho benefits immensely from having incredible hard rock minerals that stibnite mine and gold and silver, copper, molybdenum. We have this enormous industry that is largely untapped because of approvals and because of the stigma from mining operations long past that acted poorly. Do you think that there's going to be any support in encouraging more outside capital investment in that area as well? Because again, you can't have one without the other. Even we could build all the nuclear reactors we want, but if we don't have the fuel and we don't have the raw material and then we don't have the refining capability, it's like, okay, these all need to go in lockstep to work.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the good news is we've got everything we need in this country. That's the good news. We really do. We are. I think Ronald Reagan used to say, America is like this great natural athlete, born with the strength and the physical tools to perform at an incredibly high level. That's the United States of America. We have the resources to do anything that we need to do and be self-sufficient in that regard. In my opinion, the less than good news is we have convinced ourselves that it's not safe or it's not friendly to the environment, or somehow, some way it's better to have China or Ukraine or Russia or India produce it instead of us. Well, there's a lose-lose scenario because the U.S. has the most efficient, environmentally friendly harvesting techniques for these minerals, but yet we stop ourselves through regulatory or legal channels. We stop ourselves from doing it. But we need it, and so that means we go and we buy it from China, or we buy it from Russia, or we buy it from India, or whatever, who have very little, if any, environmental concerns. They just do whatever they got to do to harvest it, and that's it. Well, we live on the same planet, and so my argument is, no, we do it the best. We do it the most environmentally friendly. And, some of that industry maybe has earned some negative reputations over the years with bad practices. That's really changed. And if you take a look at a modern mine, whether it be a in-ground mine or a surface mine, the technology is so different and it's so much friendlier to the environment. And so I believe there's a win-win scenario here. And that's for us to control it, the United States of America, for us to use our own resources, reduce or eliminate the dependence on our enemies, because we're basically purchasing stuff from our enemies or I won't say enemies necessarily, but those without the same interests at home that we have.
Sure.
And do it more environmentally friendly. Everybody wins. And there's a third win that comes out of this. If we do this right, that puts us in a position to potentially export either some of the minerals or some of the energy. And when you export energy, when you export minerals, that means you're selling to whomever, whether it be friend or foe, and your enemies or not. Okay, and so that puts you in a tremendous position with foreign policy. If you're an energy exporter, for example, and we're selling whatever it might be, minerals or natural gas or whatever, to France, Germany, that means they're not buying it from Russia. That means they're not buying it from China. That helps us in multiple ways with foreign policy. So there's a lot of things that are intertwined here, but to your point, we have the resources we need. We just need to convince ourselves that it's okay to use what God gave us.
Yeah, yes to all of that, and thank you for it. The thing that I've been struggling with is, to your point, yeah, we have everything we need. We have the best, safest practices, but we actually discourage these industries, which leads to, best case scenario, it's China doing it in China. But what's more likely is they're just contracting with some, whoever, dictator or warlord, whoever it might be in like the Congo, to get, cobalt out. And who's actually doing it? It's not even Chinese kids. It's, poor kids in Africa. So it's kind of like we're trashing on the most vulnerable populations in the world.
Yes.
And we, the United States, feel so great because we're like, no. We're nice and pristine. We don't have to worry. We have great regulations, but those regulations actually are counterintuitive because it destroys the world anyway. So
With slave labor, usually.
with slave labor, right? Like kids that are dying under the age of 10, all for our cell phones. Now, mind you, if I had a way to opt out of either of these processes where it's like, okay, I would like to buy my cobalt from Idaho, right? Like get Jervois going, and quite unfortunately, international interests flood the market with cobalt as Jervois is trying to get going. So then Jervois, as a capitalistic mechanism, can't function. So it's like, okay, well, we can't do that. Can I just stop using these things? No, you can't do that either, because everything in this room is using rare or critical materials. So there is no other option if we actually in the United States intend to have a humanitarian bent and philosophy that is in line with our actions. Like, well, the only reasonable action, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be to repatriate these industries and do them the best, safest way possible, and have those signs up that are like, 1,000 days since the last accident, and things like that, instead of, being in the river.
You're absolutely right, and I'm going to share some more good news. I like to focus on good news.
God bless it.
We've had recently some success in getting a couple of mine permits in Idaho. This is my 7th year in Congress. Before this, I was in the state legislature back to 2005, and I believe that these permit processes were in place that entire time, at least since I was in the state legislature prior to coming to here. That makes it incredibly difficult for the industry because they don't have the predictability. How do you capitalize a mine and not know if you're going to get it permitted in 20 years? I mean, it's an amazingly onerous process. But there is good news, and I would like to tell you that it's the stellar work of the congressional delegation that got these permits in place. And I'll take a little bit of credit for promoting it, because I did promote it. However, I would argue the biggest reason that those permits came through weren't because of me or the delegation. It was the Department of Defense. Because the Department of Defense doesn't like being subject to having to purchase raw material from people that don't necessarily have our interests at heart. And so we actually have an ally now, and it's us, in realizing how important it is to control your own destiny. And the good news is we got it, but we've limited our access to it. But now that's starting to get realized, and those policies are starting to change. And I have to tell you, part of this, it goes with the current administration. The 4 years with the previous administration, it was like talking to a brick wall. Seemingly no concern or care whatsoever that there is no source for certain critical minerals in the U.S. at all, and you have to buy it from your enemies, and uranium is one of those examples, right? Or enriching it, whether it be for power production or military use. You have to depend on somebody outside of our country. Are you kidding me? And you have those conversations with the previous administration, and they would just basically not even respond. That's different now. And that's it's not just the congressional front, but what a difference an administration makes, what a difference a presidential change makes. And in this case, this administration gets it. They're encouraging the executive branches and their agencies to work with us, and we're starting to see some progress because of that.
May I ask, and again, I appreciate your time. I know it's a work day for you. You mentioned right as we began that water and healthcare were the two biggest things. I had a
Most complex.
great, most complex, and we got to keep people alive. That's a big one. I had a conversation with Dr. Jim Souza from St. Luke's. He's the chief medical officer just on last, I believe, Friday, and to talk about the complexity. You have all of these entities that exist in various states of for-profit and non-profit, whatever. So you have insurance companies, you have hospital systems, you have, pharmaceutical companies. Then you have the end consumer of medicine, right? And of course, along there, you have all these different medical practitioners and people engaged in it. And there's a huge problem with that. I mean, aside from what everybody's experienced in the last 5 years, you have this huge problem with like, oh my God, like, how do these entities even look at me? Like, am I just a profit margin for them? Am I somebody that they're actually trying to take care of? And then you obviously have the increasing cost of healthcare. Like, what is there anything that can be done at the very least to start helping people deal with the increasing cost of healthcare in Idaho? Because I interviewed Brian Whitlock from the Hospital Association recently, and he was talking about the projected increase of cost to everybody in the coming years, and he was like, it's going to be unbelievable.
Well, once again, incredibly complex subject, but I would address that by saying this. I think somewhere in the last decade or two, we've gotten insurance confused with healthcare. And they're two wildly separate things, or by definition they are, but in reality they're not. And part of the reason we've confused insurance with healthcare is because of government involvement through Medicare, Medicaid, and basically defining what processes, what procedures can be covered and what can't. And so the government has really injected itself. Affordable Care Act, in my opinion, was never designed to be affordable, and it was never designed to maximize care. It was designed to break the system so that government would need to be a single provider, a single payer. And I think that's played out. We just saw some data last week that healthcare costs has increased over 80% on average just since the Affordable Care Act got put into place. And that, in my opinion, is because we've inserted government into all these programs. The answer, I believe, is to do what has made America great in terms of prosperity. Let the markets work. We've got to empower our markets. The market system, the free market works if you let it. But we've intervened so much in the healthcare space by putting programs in place, and there needs to be, there's some vulnerable that's got to have some protections and whatnot. But what we've done is we've expanded the government involvement to involve just about everybody, regardless of the circumstances. It's difficult for wealthy people who are required to purchase certain things when, they'd just prefer to pay as they go because they can, right, and not be part of the system whatsoever. But they get caught up in it because of Medicare requirements, Medicaid requirements, and all this. I don't pretend to have the nuts and bolts solution because it's a very, very complex scenario. But I do know that if we push the system more towards a market-based one, and we let providers compete, and whether it be pharma, whether it be the medical provider, whether it be the nursing system, whatever the hospital system, if they're competing, that's going to overall drive the price down. The other thing is, and the president is working on this right now, and so is Congress to some extent, is the entitlements. We've got somewhere around, we think, 20 million more people than we had 4 years ago that crossed the border illegally, that for the most part has access to the public care system, right? Public health care system. They go to the emergency rooms for their health care. It's the most expensive delivery system on the planet, or at least in the US. And that just rolls into the overall taxpayer burden as a function of that. So the entitlements need to be addressed. In my opinion, the government involvement needs to be reversed. I tell people this, you never want the collective me making your healthcare decisions. And by default, I am right now, because I'm part of the system that defines the Medicaid payments. I'm part of the system that defines the Medicare payments. What that ultimately does is that sets the marker for private insurance carriers, because they follow Medicare, Medicaid. And I, the collective I, as members of Congress, end up defining the care, defending the and thereby ultimately rationing it out. So, and that's not what I should be doing. That's not what Congress should be doing, in my opinion. We should be letting the market dictate this. Is this going to be fixed overnight? No. But I do think we're starting to point things in the right direction and shift that a little bit. People are coming to the realization that I think we do still have the best healthcare system in the world, but we're working pretty hard to tear it down, because, and I know multiple young people that have been very outstanding students that would love to go into the medical field, but they're not going to consider those professions because they don't want somebody like me dictating how much money they can make, right? And that's really what's happening now. So we've got to let the market re-engage. We've got to let those industry forces compete and start setting prices via competitive availability, not some government program. And that's a very, very wordy answer that probably doesn't explain much of a solution to anybody, but just think of it this way. Privatizing good, government bad, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to healthcare.
I gotcha. Listen, I know it's a working day. I think we've run over time. I really appreciate you taking time. Is there anything you'd like to hit here at the end?
So now that we're back in session, look for a lot of focus on the things we talked about. And first of all, there's my understanding is there's another legal challenge on the removal of the dams. So we'll see how that works out. But I think we've taken all the precautions necessary, or at least that we can, on the congressional front to prevent that from taking place. There is a deadline for addressing subsidies, or what happens with the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act by the end of this year. And so that's got to be addressed. And therein lies the debate is, okay, the system hasn't been working well. Do we want to continue subsidizing it, or do we increase those subsidies, or we do something different? So there's the debate there. The other one, especially with the committees that I'm on, is energy, commerce, and natural resources. That's all things energy. We're trying to identify everything we possibly can influence to allow the industry to create more sourcing, because we know with the technology, data centers, AI, and frankly, the commerce that's being driven back to the U.S. through some of the president's policies, there's a lot of industry coming back to the U.S. or coming to the U.S. that needs power. And we just don't have it. And one last thing that pops into my mind, I personally know of 3 companies, because they've come and talked to me, and they're all names you would know, and all companies I think that you and I think most Idahoans would agree would be a very attractive employers in our state, that would be coming to Idaho if they knew they had a dependable, reasonably priced source of power, and they don't. And Idaho's not unique that way. We're one of many states in that situation. So it's all things power when it comes to energy, commerce, and natural resource. We know that we've got to streamline processes and let the private sector work.
God bless it. Thank you for your time today. And I will be back in the next couple of months as well, so I'd love to connect again if possible.
Let's do it.
All right.
All right.